Welcome to No More, Risk Better, a CreditSights podcast. Across the global strategy team, we aim to make sense of the macro and the micro, highlighting opportunities and the risks facing the fixed income markets.
As the macro makes headlines, we leverage our network of experts across Fitch Solutions to better understand economic trends, rates gyrations, geopolitical events, and how these factors impact corporates.
At CreditSights, we understand that credit investing comes down to picking winners to generate alpha and avoiding losers. Our team of over 100 analysts across the US, Europe, and Asia provide unmatched sector expertise and fundamental knowledge.
In our weekly podcast, the strategy team offers a look at the conversations we have with our colleagues, including analysts, fellow strategists, economists, and leveraged finance market experts. If you want to know more so that you can risk better, you'll want to give this podcast a listen.
Hello, everyone. Happy New Year, and thank you for tuning in to the first episode of No More, Risk Better for 2026. We are glad to have you back. I'm excited to be your host. I'm Zach Griffiths, head of U.S. investment grade and macro strategy, and today we are going to be covering an extremely topical discussion talking about the economic and financial market implications of the recent capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. I'm delighted to be speaking with Conor Beakey, who is the head of America's Country Risk at our sister company, BMI. Conor, thank you so much for coming back on the show. I think last time we had you on, we were discussing the U.S. economic outlook with a focus on fiscal policies, so you always seem to be the right guy to turn to no matter what the key market driver of the day is.
I guess a jack of all trades and a master of none. Thanks for having me.
All right. So unless you've been living under a rock, our listeners are likely aware that the U.S. has arrested Venezuela's president and charged him with drug trafficking, among other crimes. And this comes following months of escalation with Venezuela and targeting supposed drug ships by the U.S. government. So this isn't completely out of nowhere. But Conor, what's your base case in terms of what happens in Venezuela from a political power perspective? President Trump has suggested that the U.S. will run Venezuela for a period of time. Do you really think that's what ultimately will happen? Kind of run us through your scenarios as you see it today.
Yeah, so I guess first thing to say is just a remarkable start to the year, and we'd already expected that this was going to be a very eventful year for Latin America. I suppose this is still conjecture, but right now it does seem as though that the kind of the strike itself was potentially carried out with some involvement of the kind of the figures surrounding President Maduro, or now kind of departed President Maduro, with that regime headed by the then president and now kind of interim president Delcy Rodriguez, who kind of agreed to facilitate, or at least in our mind appeared to facilitate, Maduro's capture and then work with the Trump administration after the fact. So I guess in that respect, as I said, you could kind of view it as a coup with U.S. support, though again, nothing is confirmed. And the Venezuelans, at least, are not necessarily themselves feeling very comfortable at the moment. We saw there was an unscheduled flyby by a drone that was operated by the Venezuelan military itself. It prompted some panic last night, and that resulted in a series of explosions and gunfire surrounding the presidential palace. And I guess that just gives you a sense of just how paranoid the remnants of the regime the regime are. But assuming, I guess, that kind of internal coup narrative is correct, in our mind, that really opened up the possibility of there being like four scenarios. So the first, and this was in the piece we put out last Saturday, was this idea of there being regime change or regime continuity with behavioral realignment. And we've kind of since shortened that to just regime realignment. And in this scenario, authority is redistributed among the elites that are kind of willing to kind of accommodate Trump and, who may already have collaborated with the US. The assumption is not all insiders survived the transition and that, there is no, but at the same time, there's no elections or any elections that are held are kind of diluted. So these guys still hold on to power, but what they do to satisfy the US is they offer substantive concessions on things like narcotics enforcement and oil, while kind of agreeing to maybe partially liberalize the economy itself. So that's our base case. The other three scenarios are: one is hardline regime continuity, where you have authority, you have a similar sort of situation, I guess, to our base case. But what happens is that the administration, or the new administration under Delcy Rodriguez, ultimately kind of opts not to go along with the Trump administration, as it has signaled that it will do to date. And that the assumption would be that they do that because they feel as though that the US is unlikely to commit a second string of attacks due to domestic political constraints. And then the other two scenarios would be a managed democratic transition, which I think is pretty straightforward. And then the last one is fragmentation and instability. There's some sort of internal split. What you saw at the presidential palace, or what we appear to be seeing at the presidential palace yesterday, becomes reality. And there's this kind of a free for all, because there's a power vacuum, and that's also a scenario where we'd see the greatest risk of the US being inadvertently drawn into a conflict, if it looked to support the Rodriguez administration itself. And I would just say that, and I know I've been talking for a while, it's just that indications to date are, I guess, that our base case is playing out. Delcy Rodriguez has stepped into the role of interim president unopposed. Something that had been effectively pre-announced by the Trump administration, when he had signaled, as you said, that they were going to allow to the US to effectively run the country. And the Rodriguez herself has, after initially kind of adopting a more defiant tone, been willing to really adopt much more kind of a language of collaboration. So she's talked about this idea of that it's required for the US and the Venezuela to potentially collaborate on an agenda of cooperation shortly after holding her first kind of Chavista-heavy cabinet meeting on Sunday night.
So what's your assessment in terms of the initial defiant comments? Was that sort of just a little bit of political theater to not appear to be completely in bed, for lack of a better term, with the Trump administration? Because it seemed like it was only a matter of a few days before the tone switched, and seemed to align very well with that base case scenario that you put out in your piece last Saturday. And just to be clear, we're recording this on January 6th in the afternoon. It's definitely a quickly developing story. But how do you think about balancing what we've heard from Delcy Rodriguez so far, and how that impacts the likelihood or the likely path forward from here?
Yeah, so we were quite surprised, only because we thought that she would have to play to a domestic audience, as you said, and the kind of the media coverage in the US, at least, after the events on Saturday, was like they were that the Trump administration was briefing the US media that there was a recognition within the White House, and that she had to make the kind of the right noises domestically. Our impression is that potentially Trump himself, who does tend to care quite a lot about optics, as we all know, may or may not have reached out to the Venezuelans and said, you better start adopting a more collaborative tone, you better start toning down the rhetoric. And the risk, with doing that would be that it would undermine Delcy Rodriguez's position itself, because it would be clear, if this is what actually happened, that it was an internal coup with US support, that she's this kind of duplicitous figure. But the fact that we haven't seen any signs of internal dissent to date suggests that maybe we were overstating that risk. And it is worth noting that not only did Delcy Rodriguez talk about this cooperation agenda on Sunday, her brother, who's Jorge, who's the head of the National Assembly, also spoke on Monday, and he kind of indicated, after she'd been formally sworn in, that the administration within Venezuela recognized that there was a need to kind of course correct.
So how much does this all matter? And what I mean by that is, can you frame up for us Venezuela's economy, its exports and oil production? I think the one figure anyone tuned into the press or financial press on all this is 300 billion of reserves in Venezuela, being the largest in the globe. But maybe let's take a step back and kind of put all of this in context. And we can also mention just how much Venezuela has been sanctioned and how that's kind of crippled the economy to a certain extent. Why don't you sort of lay out some of the key factors there as you see them?
Yeah, I think it's telling that the reaction in Brent has been pretty modest. I mean, the days of Venezuela being a major oil producer are long behind us, and the scope for a meaningful lift in production, at least in terms of global production, is quite limited, despite the hype, as you say, about these 300 billion barrels of the black stuff that Venezuela nominally possesses. And I guess just on this, your audience might be interested to know that this 300 billion figure is a bit misleading. So up until the mid 2000s, that number was much lower, because how reserves are determined is by calculating, what share of total oil resources can be reasonably believed to be extractable at prevailing prices and based on current technology. So within Venezuela, most of its oil is made up of this heavy to extra heavy crude concentrated in the Orinoco oil belt. And when I say heavy and extra heavy, what I mean is it's denser, it's more viscous, and it's much richer in kind of sulfur, in contrast to, say, the sweeter crude that the likes of Saudi produces. And as a result, it's much more difficult to extract and refine. So it typically trades at a pretty big discount to the benchmark. So somewhere between 10 to 15 dollars a barrel. And the prevailing view, until Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez, ordered a review in the mid-2000s, I believe, was that only about 100 billion barrels of oil could be extracted within Venezuela. But in light of the run-up in prices over the course of the 2000s, and claims that his government made of, additional developments in technology that, as it happened, PDVSA never really invested in the first place, true reserves stood at 300 billion barrels. And OPEC just kind of accepts that number. If you were to use the same logic, it would imply that, say, the US and Canada actually produce far more oil than Venezuela.
Okay, so this 300 billion, take it with a grain of salt, a grain of sulfur, whatever the proper term is. And so, okay, I think now they produce around 900,000 barrels of oil per day in a 100 to 110 barrel per day market. Is that roughly correct? I think back in 2017, it was closer to 2 million barrels. And so obviously had been a much larger producer, but when you put it in the global scale and thinking about this having a major impact on truly global oil prices, it certainly seems unlikely, especially considering just how many steps we are from perhaps U.S. companies coming in and investing what's needed to get that oil out of the ground.
Yeah, exactly. So actually, if you go back to the late 90s, early 2000s, domestic production peaked at around 4 million barrels per day, and that had fallen all the way to 400,000 barrels in the middle of 2020 on the back of sanctions and the collapse in prices. Now, over the past few years, as the sanctions relief has been partially rolled out with Chevron, the big beneficiary there, and as prices have recovered, we've seen output return back to that 1 million barrel per day level. But what's actually interesting is with the ongoing kind of quasi-oil embargo that the US has in place, in addition to kind of a renewed tightening of the sanctions regime, what we've seen is domestic production looks to have declined, or at least exports declined by 40% in December. And as some of your audience might remember, from the middle of COVID, it's quite difficult if you have nowhere, if you can't export that oil, right? Like, where does it go? You run out of space quite quickly, and when that happens, you've got to start filling in wells and so on, and that can actually result in it being much harder to bring on production subsequently. Though I would say that we definitely see scope for an easing of the sanctions regime that we do anticipate, given kind of Trump's emphasis on getting the oil flowing again, that could help lift production to call it, say, 1.2 million barrels per day at some point in maybe late 26, potentially 2027. But what has to come, like the kind of what you hear about the bigger jump, so to 2 mil, and then subsequently to 4 mil barrels per day, that requires significantly more investment. So just to get to 2 million barrels per day, to do some brownfield rehabilitation and so on, you probably have to invest somewhere on the order of $20 to $30 billion at a time when prices, there's a bit of there's a lot of the major trading houses are relatively downbeat about production and so on. And then you're kind of having to compare the potential or the kind of the risk reward of maybe restarting operations in Venezuela relative to kind of investing in more favorable and more stable operating environments. And then in the longer term, that 4 million barrel per day number that would require, our oil and gas team estimates upwards of $100 billion worth of investment, and that's extremely unlikely to materialize. And if it were to materialize, it would probably take somewhere between 6 to kind of 10 years, because all of that would be greenfield projects, and it just takes a long time for that to come online.
All right, so in terms of any really material technical impact on the oil market, that's quite a ways down the road, if it's likely at all. And I think there's a ton of uncertainty left. I mean, the U.S. is not running Venezuela. Does it seem like to you that the first order impact, let's say if this regime is conciliatory and willing to sort of take the direction of the U.S. to Trump's liking, is the removal of sanctions or easing of sanctions kind of the first step in terms of, I guess, that relationship evolving, perhaps, if that's the right way to think about it?
So the first step, I guess, will be to ease the kind of quasi-oil embargo, right? And if that kind of has to happen in the very near term, right? In order to prevent this issue of the infrastructure itself deteriorating even further. Beyond that, yeah. So I think on a 6 to 12 month horizon, we're starting to think about sanctions being rolled back more fully. But the Venezuelans themselves are going to have to kind of give something up for that to happen. So we'll see if that takes shape. And what we will be really looking out for here is kind of reforms to the hydrocarbon laws and so on to make it much more favorable, or to so substantially improve the kind of risk reward for U.S. majors operating in the region.
All right, that's certainly helpful. And so, as the head of America's country risk, are there other nations you see currently at risk of the U.S. meddling in them, for lack of better term? And I think it'd be helpful also to frame up this intervention by the U.S. It seems like an extreme measure, but from what I understand, there's quite a few historical precedents if you're willing to go back over the past 40 or 50 years. So maybe starting with, are there any, Latin American nations in particular that you now see as at more risk following this move, and then maybe some historical context around this would be great.
Okay, so I think it might help to kind of put some context on how the administration's been approaching the region more generally over the past year,
Right.
to kind of to answer that question initially. And I guess the first thing that I'd say here is that, the action in Venezuela itself is just the most dramatic piece of evidence that we have of this sort of wholesale shift in U.S. policy towards Latin America. So it was kind of dismissed at the time. But really, since Trump's inauguration we're coming up to the year anniversary now, he has been signaling that Latin America would feature much more prominently in U.S. foreign policy. It's kind of been the forgotten child. And it would feature much more prominently moving forward. So there's this idea that Latin America is going to feature much more prominently in the US's foreign policy thinking. And I guess in some respects, you could kind of view that alongside the tariffs of kind of Trump's aim to kind of turn back the clock to the long 19th century. And as part of this shift, the president has been invoking the ghost of Monroe, the Monroe Doctrine, which is his kind of interpretation, or at least in his mind, was equivalent to a declaration of U.S. hegemony within the Western Hemisphere all the way back in 1820. But I guess as an aside, if you wanted to be pedantic about that, you'd kind of point out that the Monroe Doctrine was in fact an aspirational statement. Remember that 200 years ago, the US was far from the power that it is today. And in some respects, it would be better to kind of interpret the Monroe document itself, or the doctrine, as almost a call for a mutual defense pact aimed at preventing European powers from regaining control of the various republics that were propping up the region at the time, as Latin America went through its own kind of revolutions of independence. And so the quote unquote kind of Monroe Doctrine has a dramatically different goal, right? It's centered on addressing real or imagined threats to US national security. And it's very much consistent with Trump's broader America First ideology. So this updated doctrine is about putting pressure on governments in the region to kind of reduce migration, tackle drug trafficking, and kind of facilitate a US investment into the domestic natural resource sector. Now, to an extent, there's also a focus on reducing the presence of the US's ideological foes, so most notably China in the region. But I think that angle is a little overplayed. I think there's a recognition within the administration that China is the key destination for most of South America's commodity exports, and that similarities in terms of the composition of export baskets means that those exports were very unlikely to go to the US in the first place. And I guess one other thing I should say here is just that with Trump, personnel is policy. So we do also really need to consider the incentives of various actors of the administration when considering policy and how to interpret this sort of Monroe Doctrine. And when it comes to Latin America, Marco Rubio very clearly has a big role in determining the administration's stance. So he's a son of a Cuban migrant, and as a result, kind of overthrowing the communist regime there is obviously quite important. And you could kind of reinterpret events in Venezuela in this life. It's kind of about in this kind of interpretation, extracting or removing Maduro was about preventing the Venezuelan regime from continuing to export oil to Cuba, which even through H1, Venezuela was still responsible for about its exports of oil were still responsible for about 1/3 of domestic consumption of oil within Cuba itself. Remember, Cuba's been effectively enduring this economic catastrophe, and there's been these widespread blackouts over the last couple of years. So I guess, with that in mind, going back to your original question, in terms of what countries might be next, I would say that, it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that the Diaz-Canel government in Cuba is kind of next on the administration's naughty list, if we wanted to cover that, call it that, I guess. But we do still think it's much less likely that you see a military operation of the sort that we've seen here. The regime in Cuba is much more ideologically cohesive, so it's hard to find a sort of Delcy Rodriguez figure. And that means that there's a much greater chance of the US being drawn into a conflict that it doesn't want to fight. In addition to that, kind of there's been no effort to kind of frame the Cuban government as a narco-terrorist organization in the same way Trump did with Cuba or Venezuela. It's kind of hard to argue at this point, given the regime has existed for 50 years, that Cuba represents a serious national security threat. And then, there's also the fact that it's much closer to home. So if you get this sort of quagmire, there's a much larger possibility that you set off a migrant crisis of the sort that contributed to Biden's dreadful approval ratings throughout the second half of his term in office in particular. So with that in mind, the more logical outcome in Cuba would be that the US would effectively step back and hope that the ongoing catastrophe and that the country is enduring will result in the collapse of the regime itself. Outside of Cuba, countries will be keeping an eye on are Nicaragua, given the opposition of the White House to the Ortega regime, Colombia, because President Gustavo Petro has openly clashed with Trump over the past year. You might remember he's been barred from the US after the UN week back in November or September. He suggested that US soldiers should disobey Trump's orders. And then finally in Mexico, where there's not necessarily this tension between the two governments, but Trump's own rhetoric suggests that he would really like to bomb the cartels operating in Mexico. He thinks that would kind of satisfy his base. But all of those are more just things we're keeping an eye on. Our assumption is that we won't see the US intervene in the same way that it did in Venezuela. I'm sorry, that's a very long answer to your question. There's a lot going on.
No, that's great. I think that the historical context is very helpful. And the other thing, we've been doing some analysis on our end, looking at past U.S. interventions. For me, I remember Libya back in 2011. I think Afghanistan and Iraq in 01 and 03 respectively are certainly, I would say, within the general population's memory, perhaps not for our younger people, but then even going back to Haiti in 94, Panama in 89, and Grenada in 83. And we went back and looked at some of the market reactions to these events just to try to contextualize what, has a big geopolitical move like this caused a big risk off shift in flows. And our analysis suggests not really. You've actually seen that the Treasury curve bear steepen. So, I'm just looking at a 1 week period. So kind of zooming in on the here and now. Equities had rallied about 1.4% on average across those instances. Credit spreads have tightened, and you saw equity market volatility fall, while bond market volatility using the MOVE index actually increased, and the dollar really didn't move too much. It tended to weaken across these episodes. And within that, we also include June 2025, the bombing of Iran. And so I feel like there's all this discussion about it, concern from a market perspective, but as I'm looking at the screen right now, the S&P is up 0.6% today. I think it was up a similar amount yesterday. So clearly it's not a huge market driver as of right now. And looking over a longer time frame after these types of events, I think it's hard to isolate the impact of these events versus all the other economic and financial market narratives. But to me, what certainly would cause more of a front and center geopolitical risk-off shift is if the U.S. actually targets Greenland. And if this move truly increases the likelihood, I know Trump's been talking about it quite a bit. It's kind of been in and out of the headlines. How do you view this move in terms of, do you think it actually increases the likelihood that the Greenland stuff is not just talk, or is that maybe oversimplifying these two things being related, I suppose?
I mean, I think the risk of any sort of extreme scenario materializing is unquestionably increased since last Friday. Personally, I feel like you could definitely see Trump taking pride in being the first president since Eisenhower to expand the size of the US. I think that's right. But the way in which our kind of politics team is thinking about this is that there's still enough of the blob present in DC that the administration wouldn't try to do something like this, given it would inevitably result in a rupturing of the Transatlantic alliance itself. And I guess what I'd also point out is that, if this were an option that was actively under consideration at the moment, you would expect to see more evidence of a major military buildup in the region. And you'd have to assume that Congress would take a much more forceful stance this time round if that buildup were to begin, given that, surprise, surprise, it's become clear after the weekend that long-standing norms won't necessarily constrain Trump in any meaningful sense.
All right. So I think that's a fair assessment, and, to be determined what happens next. I think the last thing I'd like to end with you, I know we've covered a lot, and this has been very helpful perspective. Are there any dates you're watching, or timelines in the future? I think when I went back and I was going through your note, I know kind of outlined, at least in the Venezuelan constitution, maybe it's 90 days that the vice president can rule. If the president is just unable to, for whatever reason, and then the National Assembly, which you mentioned, Delcy Rodriguez's brother is the head of, can extend that another 90 days should the situation warrant. Does any of that matter? Are there other items that you're watching in terms of like benchmarks for the next steps ahead?
So the 90 days is important, but I guess what I would say here is that even the interpretation that the Supreme Court in Venezuela gave the Constitution itself, this idea that Maduro is only temporarily incapacitated rather than permanently incapacitated. If he'd been permanently incapacitated, there would have had to have been elections in 30 days. To me, it seems pretty clear that this guy is permanently incapacitated. So the assumption would be that they're just going to continue to roll on this period for as long as they can. I guess one thing that would be interesting is, to date, the Trump administration has kind of dismissed the potential for the U.S. kind of conducting some sort of nation-building exercise, or at least pressuring the Delcy Rodriguez administration into holding elections. It would be interesting at the end of that 90-day period, is there any signs that the U.S. is kind of shifting its view there and is kind of going to pressure the Assembly into holding an election? But aside from that, I guess what will really be focused rather than dates is just, are there any signs of internal dissent within Venezuela? Are there any signs that Delcy Rodriguez's own position is under threat? And as I said last night, we were just about to publish our note, and I saw these explosions in the presidential palace, and I thought, well, here we go again. We were being wrong on our base case. So they're the sort of events that we'll be tracking rather than necessarily looking that far ahead at dates well in the future.
And I got to ask, it seemed like, and I'm not familiar with Venezuelan politics at all. Obviously, Maria Machado just won the Nobel Prize. She's part of the opposition in Venezuela. And again, with my complete lack of knowledge of her policies and just general understanding that Maduro has not been a good leader in Venezuela for any number of reasons, seemed like working with her from the U.S. perspective probably would have been a popular move within Venezuela. Are you surprised that Trump has, for at least the time being, more or less dismissed her as a viable alternative? And I don't think there are any indications that the U.S. is looking to push for new elections at this time, which seems like should be part of the consideration, at least.
Yeah, so it's clearly uncomfortable, right? She's been kind of pushed to one side, and you do, like Trump said on Saturday, in what appears as though it was a major own goal, that she doesn't command the respect of the Venezuelan people. But like, this is a woman whose surrogate candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, in elections held in 2024, almost certainly won somewhere between 60 to 70%, close to 70% of the vote in an election that was just stolen by the Maduro administration. So she does have the respect of the Venezuelan people. I guess the issue from a US perspective is she doesn't control any of the institutions. And this is something that reportedly came up. This is what the coverage suggests, is that, Rick Grinnell, who's special envoy to the region for the White House, was talking to Machado, and she couldn't necessarily communicate a credible path for her kind of taking power. And kind of Rubio echoed that sentiment on Sunday in his appearances on the morning shows and so on. From the US's perspective, ultimately, this is the best risk-reward outcome once you decide to go in and take out Maduro. You don't risk getting bogged down into this drawn-out conflict that could very easily end up metastasizing into, in a very worst-case scenario, Vietnam. And at the same time, you do nominally achieve these or you kind of extract these concessions from the Delcy Rodriguez administration. So you have, you would expect, we'll see whether this actually materializes, but you would expect there will be efforts made to push out Russia, China, and Iran, who all nominally have significant involvement in the country. You'll have a clampdown on drug trafficking. You'll have efforts made to liberalize the oil sector and to kind of secure U.S. access to quite a considerable resource. And then so all of those are developments that are nominally, or you get to achieve that without giving up a huge amount. But it certainly feels quite icky. Yeah.
All right, Conor, this was a great discussion. I really appreciate you coming on. I have an inkling that we may be looking to have you on for another special episode or two as this unfolds. So we'll certainly be in touch on that.
Great. Thanks for having me, Zach.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in to the first episode of No More Risk Better for 2026. We look forward to you to tune in to many more great episodes this year. Thanks again, Conor. Thanks to you all for listening, and we'll catch you next time on No More Risk Better.
CreditSights disclaimer. All price references correspond to the date of this recording. This podcast should not be copied, distributed, or reproduced in whole or in part. Neither CreditSights nor its affiliates makes any representation or warranty as to the accuracy or completeness of any information contained in this podcast. CreditSights is not providing investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, is not providing research or making any recommendations, nor is CreditSights offering or soliciting any transaction with respect to the purchase or sale of any security. The receipt by this listener of this podcast is not the giving of advice by CreditSights or its affiliates.